Hi. Very, very warm welcome to Big Questions. My name is Sunny. I'll be hosting today. If this is your first time coming here, thank you so much for coming along. I hope that you enjoy this lunchtime and find it useful and interesting for your own thinking. So here at Big Questions, we have a very simple aim. We want to ask, discuss, and help each other to think about the questions that lots of us have about life, about meaning, and Christianity. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of suffering. How do we make sense of suffering? And in a moment, I'll be inviting up Dr. Vince Vitale, who will give us a short talk, and there'll be time for questions and answers after that. So do be texting in any questions that you have. If you look at the white feedback forms on your tables, there's a number at the bottom, and you can be texting in throughout the talk any questions that you have for Vince. Vince is a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, and as well as that, he is working for various Christian organizations, and that involves doing events like this and talks that are aimed to explore the questions of modern society with the unchanging claims that Christianity makes in the Bible. So we're absolutely delighted that he'll be here to speak for us today. Do be texting in questions. And yeah, without further ado, Dr. Vince Vitale.
Thank you, Sunny. It's great to get such a good crowd for such a mediocre speaker. Appreciate that. It's always particularly meaningful for me to have a chance to speak in a university context, because when I showed up at university, I thought Christianity was probably a load of rubbish. I did meet some Christians. They challenged me to have a look at the Bible for the first time, and so I got a Bible and I started to read through it, and I would cross things out and I would add things, and I'd write a big BS in the margins wherever I disagreed, and Christians would sort of look over my shoulder and say, "Why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible?" And I'd say, "That verse makes for a great Bible study." Over time, my attitude towards Christianity began to change. I continued to read through the Bible, and especially the Gospels, which were records of Jesus' life. And I just found myself believing that Jesus had lived the most beautiful life that I had ever seen, that he was a man who was very worth following. I also came to think that Christian faith was intellectually satisfying, something which initially would have seemed crazy to me, but more and more as I looked into it, that's what I came to find, that it made sense not only down here, but also up here as well. But I still had big questions. This was one of the biggest questions. I think it's a really serious challenge to faith. I think it's one that we need to take really seriously as Christians. That's why I did my PhD research in this area, because I think it's a really serious challenge. I'm going to offer some thoughts about it today, and then as Sunny said, we'll have a little discussion, then I'll come back up. I'll be really happy to take any questions that you have. I brought a few of my students with me from Oxford as well, who also would be really happy, and I'll probably just hang around here at the end with me for anybody who wants to talk further. We'll stay as long as people want to talk. Some of my reflections on this topic of suffering began with a conversation I had with my Aunt Regina. Now, this is about a decade ago. It's probably the first conversation I had on this question of suffering in God, and she shared with me about some of the suffering that she was experiencing with respect to her son, Charles, my cousin, who suffered from a serious mental and physical disability. And she shared with me about this. I then began to share with her some of my more abstract philosophical explanations for why God might allow suffering. She listened to me really patiently, and then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." Explanations were not what my Aunt Regina needed at that time. Sometimes we do need explanations. I'm a philosopher. I'm fully committed to that. But other times we just need to know that there's someone who understands what we're going through and is crying along with us. And so I just want to recognize at the start that in a room this big, some of us are going to be here because we have intellectual questions that we need to work through. Some of us are going to be here or just happen to find ourselves here at a time where we're going through something really serious, a really serious type of suffering. And just to say, if that's where you're at, and if you want to talk about that, if you just want someone to listen about that, if you wanted anyone to pray about that, maybe you're not even sure that prayer works, but you just think this is the sort of thing, if I was ever going to try to see if prayer works, this would be the time. We'd count that a really great privilege as well. All right, let me try to offer offer a few responses to this question. This is not in any way meant to be exhaustive. There are lots of things I could talk about. In particular, I'm not going to focus on the question of free will, even though actually that's really a central component of the Christian response to this question of suffering, that God created a world in which we're free. Yes, he had the power to create a world in which he could have just determined, just forced us to always do the right thing, to always be kind to one another, to always be in strong relationship. But he created a world which is free, a world in which, yes, we can be good to each other, but because we can be meaningfully good to each other and choose that, we also can be bad to each other. Because we have the freedom to step meaningfully into relationship, it also means we have the freedom to step meaningfully out of relationship and all of the suffering that occurs when we do. So that's one central component of a response to this question from a Christian perspective, but it's probably also the aspect of the response that you've heard most. So I want to open up a couple of additional ways of thinking about this as well. The first response I'd like to consider centers on the following observation. We're not that smart. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of saying it. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of saying it. I knew that was a risky one. Other times I forget to do the dishes within only seconds of my wife telling me to. One of the assumptions that's smuggled into the thought that suffering disproves the existence of God is this assumption. If God has good reasons for allowing suffering, we should know what those reasons are. But I want to ask the question, why think that? When I take my dog Buster to the vet, and Buster needs to get a painful needle in order to avoid some terrible disease, Buster doesn't understand why he has to go through that piece of suffering. And if I sit Buster down on the couch and I try to explain to him that this is why you had to go through that piece of suffering for this reason that I had, he's not going to understand. And it's not because of my fault. It's not because I'm not communicating well enough to him. Buster simply isn't the sort of being that can always understand all of the reasons that his caretaker has for doing the things that I do. And you can see the analogy there. My ways are higher than my pet Buster's ways. Why then should we be surprised if God exists? I know that's a big if for some of you, but why should we should be surprised if God exists if some of his ways are higher than our ways? And this is one of the things that the Bible says. At one point it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Or as one other author puts it, I found this really helpful. He says, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing suffering that you can't understand. So do we have a full understanding of why God allows suffering? No. But if God is as big as Christians claim he is, perhaps that's exactly what we should expect. And if it's exactly what we should expect to find, even if God does exist and does have good reasons, then the fact that we find it doesn't seem to me that it can be strong evidence to suggest that he doesn't exist. So that's the first point I want to make. I want to share a couple more thoughts as well, and I'd like to do so by telling you a few of my favorite stories. My first one's about my parents. It's a true story. My mom and dad met when they were teenagers. They both worked in a supermarket. My mom worked as a cashier, my dad stocking the shelves, and my mom says she would call for price checks all the time when she didn't really need them so that she'd get to flirt with my dad. She says he had great shoulders. Anyway, on their first date, they went to a black tie event in New York City on New Year's Eve, and they fell in love. There's mom and dad on their first date. Then on their second date, they were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge. They were overlooking the picturesque New York City skyline, and my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about it, and she said, "Oh, that's just some ring one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." And he said, "Oh, yeah, it is nice. Let me see it." So my mom took it off, and she handed it to my dad. And my dad, he hurled it off the bridge, and he watched it sink to the bottom of the East River. And he said, "You're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore." And my mom loved it. I think it was actually the sort of clinching moment for them. Tells you something about my family dynamic there. How is this relevant to the problem of suffering? Well, It's often typical to think of the problem of suffering like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a very different world with far less suffering. And then we think to ourselves, surely God should have made me in the other world, in the world without suffering, or in the world with far less suffering. That's a very reasonable thought. But I want to suggest, I think it's a thought that relies on a philosophical mistake, because it relies on the assumption that it would still be you and me as the individuals that we are, not in this world, but in that very different world that we think we wish that God had made. And I think that that's highly controversial. See, when my dad threw that ring off the bridge, it was a pretty risky move. My mom loved it, but what if she hadn't? What if she concluded, this guy's nuts, I better run back with the old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Now, I might be tempted to think that I could have been better off. I don't know who that old boyfriend was. In fact, 50 years later now, my dad still tries to get my mom to tell him who the boyfriend was, and she still flatly refuses to say. I think she's still scared that my dad's going to go beat the guy up or something. But let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, what if this is about the right generation? What if mom's old boyfriend had been Sylvester Stallone? Now, in some ways, I might be tempted to think I would have been better off. In some ways, it would have been pretty cool to have Sylvester Stallone as a dad. I might have had a lot of money. I doubt I would have had to worry about being bullied at school if my dad was both Rocky and Rambo. But there's one problem with wishing that my mom had wound up with Sylvester or her old boyfriend rather than my dad. And the problem is this: I never would have existed. Maybe some other child would have existed, and maybe that child wouldn't have had to worry about getting bullied at school. But part of what makes me who I am, the specific individual that I am, is my beginning, my parents, the sperm and egg cells that I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. Asking why didn't God create me in that very different world is similar to saying, I wish my mom wound up with her old boyfriend. Now, I'm sure my mom and her old boyfriend would have had some very nice kids, but I would not have been one of them. We often, very understandably, when we look around at this world, wish that God would just take suffering out of the world while keeping everything else the same. But I don't think it works that way. If something as small as throwing a ring off of a bridge can affect who comes to exist, imagine how radically who comes to exist would be changed if God just miraculously removed all the suffering in the world. Imagine if he took away free will every time we thought to hurt someone. Or imagine if he radically changed our natural environment, if weather systems or plate tectonics didn't behave as they do, if the laws of thermodynamics had undergone a massive redesign. What would be the results? One plausible result is that none of us and none of the people that we love and care about most would have lived. Sometimes we understandably wish for a very different world, but I think that in doing so, without realizing it, we are sometimes wishing ourselves and the people that we love most right out of existence. And I don't think that God likes that idea. In fact, I think one of the things that God values most about this world is it was a world that allowed you to come into existence. I believe that he desired each one of you before you were born, before he created anything. Not because you're better or smarter or funnier or better looking than the other beings that he could have created. Simply out of what Christians call grace. Unmerited love. Love that you don't need to compete for. Love that you can just enjoy. I like thinking about it as the love of a parent standing over a newborn child. The question, why do you love your child? It doesn't even make sense to a parent standing over a newborn child. What do you mean, why do I love her? She's my child. I made her. I delight in her. And the Christian message is that God delights in every one of you just as you are. And I think that one of the things that God values about this world is it's a world that allowed for you to come into existence. I think he wanted you to have life, and I think he wanted to call you into eternal life with him. My cousin Charles, who I mentioned at the beginning, my Aunt Regina's son, he was an amazing man. He had very serious disabilities, but the way that he would genuinely rejoice with me when things went well in my life, despite the difficulties that he was often facing, one of the most beautiful gifts that I've ever received. Now, some people would say it would have been better if Charles never existed. The world would have included less suffering overall. The world would have been better off overall. Okay, but I want to disagree with that. Like my Aunt Regina, it's because I knew Charles intimately that his suffering was so frustrating. But it's also because I knew Charles intimately that I can understand why God would love him so much and why God would place a high value on a world that allowed for him to come to exist. I believe that God desired Charles and loved him even before the creation of the world. So that's one of the questions I want to raise today. What if God desired you? Returning to my parents' story, it's important to note that when choosing whether to have me, whether to procreate me, it wasn't just potential suffering in my life that my parents had to consider. They also had to consider what it would cost them to have me and to raise me. Love requires sacrifice. So my mom gave birth to me, and then she sacrificed countless hours of sleep to care for me. Apparently, when I was an infant, I wouldn't go to sleep unless I was holding my mom's hand. So I don't think this is the sort of proposed recommended method, but my mom pulled a mattress into my room and just slept night after night with her hand kind of draped up into my crib, holding my hand. Eventually, we got past that stage, and then one day, it's not funny. Then one day, when I was about 6 years old, 6 or 7, I was out playing American football on my next-door neighbor's front lawn, and I was playing with some older kids. I was getting knocked around pretty good. That's me around that age. I was getting knocked around pretty good. I started crying, and I came running home to my mom, who was on the front porch. Here's Mom on the front porch. There she is, sporting the classic 80s onesie. I don't like that. And I came running home to my mom. I'm crying, and I'm saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. So guess what my mom did? She did what any loving mother of a 6 or 7-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this. She got in sort of quite an athletic stance, and she hung her nose out in the air, and she looked at me lovingly, and then she said, "Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." I don't know what you're going to think about my family. And at first I just looked at her like she was crazy, and indeed she was. But she persisted, punch me in the nose, punch me in the nose. And I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, but finally I did. I reared back, and I gave my mom a straight right hand to the nose. And to my astonishment and to her astonishment, blood actually began to come out of my mom's nose and to drip down her face. But then came probably the most memorable image from all of my childhood. Then came the most just dazzling, radiant, joyful smile. My mom just smiled through this blood on her face, and she said, "Now get back out there." And she sent me back out to the American football game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. Now, you might not know what to make of that story, understandably so. What a bizarre thing for my mom to do. What an unthinkable, messy, bloody thing for her to do. But I also think, in at least one sense, what an extravagant display of love as well. When I think about the love that my mom has for me, that's the story that I go back to each time. My mom chose to bring me into this world knowing that there would be suffering. And when the suffering came and my eyes filled with tears, she bent down and stepped into my suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at the hands of her own child. And for me, That's one picture of what Jesus did on the cross, where God did something unthinkable and messy and bloody, where God bent down and stepped into our suffering, even though it meant suffering at the hands of those that he had created. Why? Because that's what a loving parent does. A loving parent does not let a child suffer alone. A loving parent steps down and takes onto himself all of the fear and the pain and the guilt and the shame that holds the child back, and then he sends the child back out with confidence and purpose and freedom and joy. Do you know that life? The night before Jesus died, as he wrestled with what he knew the next day would bring, he said these words to his friends. He said, "My heart is sorrowful, even to death." It's quite an amazing line. If it's true that this is the God of the universe, the creator of all things, and yet living a human life to come and suffer with us and saying, "My heart is sorrowful, even to death." If you've ever experienced deep depression, if you've ever thought about suicide, Jesus is right there with you. There is no depth of agony or helplessness that you can experience in this life that the Christian God does not understand. Ironically, it may be the famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche who put it best. At one point he wrote, "The gods justified human life by living it themselves, the only satisfactory response to the problem of suffering ever invented." Now, Nietzsche is actually writing about the ancient Greeks here, and he doesn't make the connection to Christianity, not explicitly anyway. But as a Christian, I'm very pleased to agree with that point and then to point to Jesus Christ. I think at the cross we really do see the uniqueness of the Christian response to suffering as opposed to any other worldview's response to suffering, because only in Jesus do we have a God who loves us enough to suffer with us. I've been considering whether God can be good and loving despite the existence of suffering. As I draw to a close, I just want to mention that that's not the only problem of suffering. There's also the problem of how we're going to deal with suffering, and that's a problem for every one of us, regardless of what we do or don't believe about God. My cousin Charles, he died a few years ago. He went to dinner with my Aunt Regina. He started choking on a piece of food. A minute later, he stopped breathing, and that was it. And I think without God to turn to, what could be more senseless than that? But as a Christian, I can't tell you how grateful I am to truly have every confidence that Charles is with the one who chose him and loved him even before he was born. He's with the one who was willing to come down and suffer alongside him. And that I will see Charles again. I'll see him in a place described in the Bible as a place where God himself will wipe every tear from our eyes, where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. I believe that before time, God chose Charles. I believe that in time, God was willing to suffer alongside him. I believe that at the end of time, God will make things right. For some people, it's because of the seriousness with which they consider suffering, it pushes them away from God. I think for me, it's precisely because of the seriousness of suffering and the need for a practical, relevant response to it that I'm led to trust a God who can do something about it. Each one of us is going to deal with significant suffering in our lives, and one day each of us is going to have to deal with the reality of death. And so a question for every one of us is, when suffering comes and when death comes, who will bear it with us and who will see us through it? As I told you, for a long time, I had a lot of misconceptions about who God is. I thought he was distant, far off, not really interested or involved in what I was going through, if he existed at all. The God I've come to believe in is nothing like that. He's personal. He desires relationship. He chose for me to exist. He loves me so much that he would come to join me in my suffering when he didn't have to. And he promises that one day he'll defeat all suffering. He promises that I'm not headed for death, but that each day I'm headed for greater and greater life. And the amazing thing that I've found is that God offers us all of this, and all he asks of us is that we accept it, that we accept him. And that really is simple. And you can do that with simple but sincere words, the way you restore any relationship. I'm sorry, thank you. I'm sorry for the times that I've turned my back on you. I'm sorry for the times that I haven't followed what I've known to be true in my life. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for being someone who loved me so much they would even come to suffer alongside me. And so my just parting encouragement to each one of you would be, if that is something that you haven't ever said to God, and as you've listened today, you've just thought to yourself, actually, if that's the God that these Christians are talking about, if it's a God who's that loving, who would love me even before I was born, who would be willing to come and suffer alongside me when he didn't have to, who promises that one day he will take me into a state where there'll be no suffering at all, if that's the loving God that Christians are talking about, then that is a God that I would want to be in relationship with. That's just an encouragement that that's all God asks of us. He doesn't ask for us to work our way up to him, to pay some price in order to be able to be in relationship with him. He comes down because he desires to be with us. And all he asks of us is that we say, I'm sorry for the things I've done wrong. Thank you for being willing to do that for me. And hopefully some of you guys, as you continue your discussions, as you go home and think about what's been said later today, maybe some of you would want to pray that really simple prayer to God at some point later today or sometime soon. That would be my hope. I hope your discussions are really enjoyable and continue to push into this topic, and I'll be really happy to take questions in a bit. Thanks so much for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Vince. And thank you for all your questions you've already texted in. Do keep those coming, and there'll also be a chance to ask questions from the floor. And yeah, do keep texting in. We'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. Great. Sorry to break into your conversations. We'll start off with a question from texted in, if that's all right.
Great.
So this is about the first part of your talk. How are we or our personalities more important than the possibility of having a world without suffering? Isn't that arrogant? We had a couple on that. Another one, why is it better to be us because of living in a world with suffering instead of being different and happier in a different world?
Yeah, really good questions. Really good. So part of what I'm saying is, I think if you change the world really significantly, I don't think it's that you come to exist, but you'll just be quite different. I think it's that you won't come to exist at all. So the question that I think is raised is, has God wronged us if he's created a world in which we come to exist and are offered eternal life, rather than creating a different world in which we never would have lived? And I think it's a really reasonable response to that to say, well, then why us? Isn't that arrogant? Why us? And actually, in the Psalms, in the first portion of the Bible, the psalmist says the same thing. He says, who is man that God is mindful of us? Why us? And I think God just found himself with love for us. And I don't think it's because I'm better or more impressive than other beings that he could have created. Those beings might have been much more impressive, but I think sometimes there can just be something extravagantly loving by seeing what's lovable in a person and loving them for that, and not worrying so much about whether or not that person is more or less worthy of love than the next person that you could create. You know, to me, that's a really attractive form of love. It's a sort of form of love where you don't ever have to worry about who's going to come around the corner or who's going to show up on the scene and whether or not they're more lovable than you are, and then maybe you don't anymore have the love of the person whose love you desire most. I think God loves each one of us inherently just for who we are as he's made us. That doesn't mean that sometimes we don't do things that he doesn't like and doesn't approve of, but he loves us the way a parent loves a newborn child, even when that child couldn't have done anything yet to earn the parent's love, but God still loves that person. I think it's a beautiful form of love, a love that you don't need to compete for, but that you can just enjoy and know is always going to be there no matter what. There's nothing you can do to extinguish that love. Just a last thing to say on that point. I'm not saying that because God has created us, he hasn't created some of the other beings that you might have in mind that you think are more impressive or who will suffer less and who maybe you think God should have created. God is very creative. The Bible suggests that he has created angels and other types of beings. Maybe God has created other universes. I'm just speculating here. I'm not saying you should believe that, but God is creative and he's powerful, and I have nothing against the idea of him also having created other beings. I just think that he has created us, and he's done so because he desired to love us and to call us into relationship with himself.
Great. Would anyone like to... Oh, yes, there's a question from the floor.
I don't quite understand how that's a relevant answer to the question, to be honest.
Great, say more.
Well, it just still doesn't seem like a good explanation. You know, just because, I mean, I get that you say, you know, he desired to love us or whatever, but I mean, if you believe in God, then still, like, it still seems arrogant, even if it's with a love thing, and it still seems like not a very good explanation at all.
Yeah, I really do feel the force of the objection, so I appreciate it. And it is arrogant. It's certainly arrogant. If I was standing up here and saying, well, God should have made me. Of course God should have made this world, because he should have made me, because I'm more important than other people he could have made, and I'm pretty impressive. If I was saying that, then it would certainly be arrogant. But the position that I'm in is the position of saying, wow, I can't believe that God would choose to make me when he could have made so many different types of beings, so many of which I'm sure would have been so much more impressive and so much better morally and in every other respect
well, that just
than
seems
me.
A bit silly of God then,
and yet, if someone chooses you, you know, regardless, that's an amazing act of love. It does come down to a question sometimes. If you don't think that God could love you extravagantly, so much so that he would desire to bring you into existence, then what I said won't make sense. That's true. But that is the central Christian claim, that God loves each one of us so much that he's willing to go to great costs to bring us into existence and to invite us into relationship with himself, displayed most of all by the fact that he would even be willing to give his life in order for that to be the case. So I see how it can be arrogant if I'm saying that actually God should have done this, but actually I'm in the position of saying I can barely believe that God's done this, but if he has, it's a great act of love. Thanks for that question.
Would you like to come back on that, or any other questions from the floor?
Hello, thank you for your talk. My question is, what about children who have suffered since young and they didn't have a chance to grow up, which means that they didn't have a chance to formulate an identity? Wouldn't it be better for them to be born in a different circumstance and possibly have a different identity? Thanks.
Just say I just missed the beginning of the question. Was it children who don't wind up?
Children who, let's say, die because of some disease when they're young, so they didn't have a chance to even have an identity, so to speak.
Yes, yeah, that's a really good question. I have had friends recently who lost a child just before birth, and they were traumatized by that, and yet they wrote me this email, and in the email they said that they had named the baby Hope, and they explained that they had named the baby Hope because they did have hope of a future time when they could be together with this child, and so I think that's an amazing hope to have, and that doesn't mean that this world is the way that it's supposed to be. I spoke at the beginning of the fact that free will can play into the brokenness of this world, and we don't, as Christians, have to say that the way everything is exactly how God intended it in the first place. But for the child who dies young, that child comes into existence in this world. If God had made a different world, then I think that child may never have lived. And even if that child dies young, which is absolutely horrendous, it's still the case that that child has been brought into existence and one day can live in the context of an eternal life, and I believe that God will bring all children to himself and they can live an eternal life with their parents and continue to develop a wonderful life. So I think that's a really significant hope to have, and we see examples of that even in the Bible. In the book of Job, one of the cases of a person who loses the most due to suffering, he loses all of his children and everything else, his animals, his wealth at the beginning. At the end of the book, it says God gave back to him a double portion of all he had lost. He's given twice the number of animals, twice the number of wealth. He's only given back the same number of children. He lost 10 children at the beginning. He's only given back 10 at the end. And sometimes I've questioned why that's the case. And something I was reading recently suggested, well, the reason is because his 10 children, which he lost, are only lost for a time. There will be a time where those 10 children and the 10 children that he has at the end of that book are all together in the context of a family life and the afterlife. So that's a great hope we can have.
Great. I'm really sorry, but I don't think we have any more time for questions.
I will stay up here as long as people want to discuss. I have 3 of my students who are training to answer big questions like these with me, and we'll be up front. So please feel free to stick around and talk as long as you like.
Great. Thank you, Vince.
Thanks, everyone.
There will be time to come and chat. Also, feel free to stay and chat on to those on your table. If you're here for the first time and would like to think some of these things through a bit more, then there's a couple of things that might be helpful. One of the things, on your feedback forms, there's a box saying, I'm interested. If you tick that, leave your name, college, and email. Someone from the Christian Union in your college will be in touch. And this is just a chance to meet up, maybe over a cup of coffee, and chat about things a bit more personally. Another thing, if you pop those in at the feedback box at the back, and there'll also be some books at the back. If you're here today as a guest of the CE, they're completely free, so do grab one if any of them take your fancy. Big Questions will be back next week, same place, same time. The brilliant speaker and thinker Andrew Fellows will be here speaking on postmodernism. Can we find meaning in a postmodern world? That should be really great, so do come back for that. If you have to rush off to a lecture now, feel free to leave. If not, stay and chat. There'll be some desserts coming around in a bit. Great, thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon.